boys and girls. I'm Nana Rose. Today's story is a story that goes back to when Americans moved from the east coast of the United States across the country toward the west coast of the United States. This is called the Josephina Story Quilt. It's by Eleanor Kaur, and the pictures are by Bruce Deegan. It's also about quilt making. And I don't know if you know, but when making a quilt, you just make a square. And then you make another square. And after you've made a whole bunch of squares, then you sew them together to make the quilt. This is a chapter book, and the contents tell you what the chapters are in the book. Josephina Story Quilt. Chapter 1 is called Josephina. It was May 1850. Faith was excited. They were going to California in a covered wagon. Please, Faith asked Ma, can I take Josephina? Josephina was her pet hen, and Faith loved her. She liked the way Josephina snuggled in her arms. She liked the way Josephina followed her around. Ma was baking bread for the journey. Ask your pa, she said. Pa and Faith's brother Adam were loading the wagon. Please, Pa, Faith said. Please, can I take Josephina? There's no room in the wagon for pets, Pa answered. That isn't fair, said Faith. Adam can bring his colt. A colt is not a pet, said Pa. A colt can carry a load of corn. What can Josephina do? Teased Adam. She's too old to lay eggs and too tough to eat. Faith's eyes filled with tears. She ran back to the house. Ma sat down in the rocker and held Faith on her lap. We all must leave things behind, she said gently. I love this rocker, but there's no room for it in the wagon. Faith gulped down her sobs. I've looked after Josephina since she was a little chick, she said. What will happen to her? Perhaps a neighbor will take her, said Ma. But nobody wanted a hen that was too old to lay eggs and was too tough to eat. The second chapter is called California Ho. Early in the morning, the wagon was ready. It had blue trim with a white cloth roof. Ma stood back to admire it. A big flower pot on wheels, she said. Isn't it beautiful? Faith did not answer. She was worried about Josephina. Did you pack the food? Ma asked Pa. And my kitchen things? Pa nodded. Then that's everything except the bedding, said Ma. Faith thought sadly. And Josephina. Pa threw mattresses into the wagon, and Ma carefully spread their patchwork quilts over them. We can't leave these behind, she said. All our joys and sorrows are sewn up into the patches. Faith picked up Josephina and held her close. We can't leave my hen either, she said. Josephina must stay, Pa said. So, put her down. Faith just stood there. She stroked Josephina's feathers and tried hard not to cry. Ma gave Pa a special look. Pa sighed. Oh, all right, Faith, he said. But if she makes any trouble, out she goes. Thank you, Pa, cried Faith. She will be good, I promise. You ever seen your parents give each other that look where they talk without saying anything? Faith put Josephina in her cage. Pa hung it high up at the back of the wagon. Then he lifted Faith up next to it. Ma handed her the rag bag. Work on a patch whenever you can, she said. Faith knew how important quilts were for remembering. We might write in a journal and keep written memories of our travels, but sewing a patch in a quilt would be a visual way of remembering. California ho! Shouted Pa. He snapped his long whip, crack. The wagon began to move. The oxen's bells tinkled, the heavy wagon chains clinked, and the wheels began their creaky song. Faith smiled happily at Josephina. This would be their home on the long trail west. Faith took some calico from the rag bag. I will make my first wagon train patch, she said. Faith began to sew a wagon wheel with careful, tiny stitches. The next chapter is called Trouble. At night, the wagons made a circle around the animals. Women cooked the meals over a campfire. Afterward, there was singing and banjo music. Faith put down the wagon wheel patch and let Josephina out for a stretch. Suddenly, woof! A dog ran up to Josephina and barked fiercely at her. Josephina squawked, "Mark!" and ran. "Come back!" yelled Faith. But it was too late. Josephina was in the middle of the animals. Horses snorted and reared. Cows kicked and mooed. Oxen bellowed. "That pesky hen!" Pa shouted and ran after her. "She almost started a stampede," Pa said angrily. "Out she goes." "Please, Pa," begged Faith, "give her one more chance." It was the dog's fault. Faith is right, said Ma. I saw the whole thing. Pa put Josephina back in her cage. Just one more chance, he said. That night, Faith whispered, Josephina, please be good. Said the hen. They understood each other, as true friends do. The next chapter is called The Rescue. For a long time, Josephina was good. She quietly watched Faith sew patches for the quilt. She didn't make a sound when hail beat down on the roof or when spring rains blew in and soaked her feathers. She made just a little cluck when coyotes howled at night. But how Josephina fussed when they crossed rivers. One day they came to a wide, muddy river. Josephina made so much noise that Faith had to take her out of the cage. She held her close. It's all right, Faith crooned. Has one of your parents ever done that with you, or have you done that to an animal? It's all right, it's okay. Pa was driving the oxen into the river. Then, squoosh! A back wheel sank into a hole. Faith let go of Josephina. Josephina fell into the river. The current carried her away. Help! Cried Faith. Save Josephina! Adam jumped into the river, but the current was too strong. It took 3 men to get them out. That does it, Pa shouted. She is too old to lay eggs, too tough to eat, and she falls into rivers. Out she goes. What do you think's going to happen? Just then, Josephina ruffled her feathers, let out a proud "Mock, mock, 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 mock," and laid a beautiful big white egg. By thunder, Pa said. She's begun to lay eggs again. Wonderful, said Ma. Now we'll have fresh eggs. So, Josephina stayed. Faith found a white scrap for the egg patch. Next chapter is called Robbers. And the only picture on this page is a patch. So, spring turned into summer. The desert was hot and dry. Faith counted her patches. Now she had 15. It was time to sew one about the desert. But one bad thing came after another. Wagon wheels kept falling off. There was not enough food for the animals. Then 3 oxen died. Pa had to throw out his heavy tools and Ma's black iron stove. 2 old people died. They were buried beside the trail. Nobody laughed or sang or smiled anymore. Faith was always hungry, but she walked on and looked for grain or seeds for Josephina. It was worse in the hills. The trail was rocky and steep. One morning, Indians came to trade buffalo meat and water. They wanted Ma's quilts. Never, said Ma. I'd rather starve. They wanted Josephina. Never, cried Faith. I would rather die. Tough decisions to make, huh? So Pa traded extra clothes for food and water. Everyone felt better after a good meal. Soon, the food was gone. If those Indians come back, Pa told Faith, we must trade Josephina for water. Faith prayed hard that they would never return. I like this, in the fact that in a lot of stories, the Indians, the Native Americans, are drawn to be horrible or mean, and in this case, they just want to trade. The night was bitter cold. Men slept under the wagons. Ma gave the quilts to Pa and Adam. She and Faith bundled in old blankets. About midnight, 2 robbers crept into camp. They sneaked up to the wagons, and when they reached for the quilts, Josephina heard them. She squawked. She's like a guard dog, huh? Everyone woke up and the robbers ran away. Pa laughed for the first time in days. Josephina may be old, he said, but she is a humdinger of a watchdog. The next chapter is called Goodbye, Josephina. Pa reached for the cage to thank Josephina, but the poor old hen was lying on the cage floor. Faith hid her face against Ma. Oh, you must be brave, Ma said softly. Josephina lived a good, long life. You can be proud of her, Pa added. She died helping us, said Adam. Faith did not feel better. She cried and cried. Ma hugged her for a long time. The next morning, they had a funeral for Josephina. Faith wrapped her in the prettiest scrap of cloth, and Adam buried her under a tall pine tree. It's always hard to lose a pet, isn't it? I miss her so, Faith said between sobs. At last, Faith dried her eyes and reached for the rag bag. I will sew a pine tree patch for Josephina, she said. Soon the wagon train found food and water. When they reached California, Faith finished the patches. That's an illustration of a pine tree patch. See that? Each one of the patches is put together to make a large quilt. Pa built a quilting frame in their new cabin. The family helped Faith sew the patches together into a quilt. The quilt covered Faith's bed. Every day the patches helped them remember the good times and the bad times of their wagon train. So it is like a diary, isn't it? And every night, Faith felt warm and happy under the Josephina story quilt. See if you can see the egg patch. See if you can see the pine tree patch. There's one maybe of desert flowers. And there's one of Josephina. And that is the Josephina story quilt. And in the back it says, author's note. In the mid-1800s, thousands of pioneers traveled to the West in covered wagons to find a better life. They usually began their journeys in the spring from frontier towns in Missouri. Families joined together to form wagon trains so they could protect and help each other. The trip to California took about 6 months. Now you get in an airplane and be there fast. Each wagon was loaded down with food, cooking pots, tools, clothes, and furniture. It took 5 or 6 pairs of strong oxen to pull one. The families traveled 12 to 15 miles each day across dangerous rivers, hot deserts, and steep, rocky trails. There was no school, but children had chores to do. Women and girls knitted, mended clothes, or sewed quilts. Patchwork quilts were given as gifts for babies, birthdays, and weddings. The most beautiful quilts won prizes at county fairs and were precious to their owners. In those days, a quilt was often the family's diary. Many patterns that are still used today, such as the wagon wheel, star over Texas, log cabin, and cactus flower, originated from the wagon train living. Some of our museums show patchwork quilts as old as the Josephina story quilt. When COVID is over and you get a chance to go to a museum or to look at things like that, there are some very beautiful quilts in museums. And if not, maybe you have some in your own home. Maybe you have a parent or a grandparent that is into quilting. But you might want to look that up on the internet and see if you yourself can make a quilt pattern. But whatever you do today, have fun.